Money talks, but sometimes silence screams louder. We've all seen the videos entitled "Tyrants Berating Service Staff, Treating People Like Furniture." But what happens when the tyrant is your own father? And what if you are the sole heir to a billion-dollar empire watching it happen? This isn't just a story about a spilled drink. It's about the moment Harrison Sterling, the Prince of New York real estate, decided to burn his own kingdom to the ground to save a stranger. You might think you know how this ends, but trust me, you are not ready for what he does in the parking lot. Let's get into it. The air inside the obsidian room didn't smell like food, it smelled like leverage. Located on the 44th floor of a glass needle piercing the Manhattan skyline, the restaurant was the kind of place where a bottle of sparkling water cost more than an hourly wage, and the silence was heavy, maintained by thick velvet curtains and the hushed whispers of men negotiating the fate of skylines. Richard Sterling sat at table 1's the power table facing the entrance. He liked to see who was coming for him. At 58, Richard was a man carved from granite and greed. He wore a bespoke Brioni suit, the navy fabric shimmering under the low ambient light, and on his wrist sat a Patek Philippe Nautilus that cost enough to feed a small village for a decade. He didn't just occupy space, he annexed it. Across from him sat his son, Harrison. At 24, Harrison Sterling looked like a softer, more reluctant version of his father. He had the same sharp jawline and the same steel-grey eyes, but while Richard's eyes were predatory, Harrison's were tired. He was currently picking at a $400 plate of Wagyu beef carpaccio, wishing he were anywhere else. Perhaps back in his loft in Brooklyn, editing the documentary footage he was secretly filming, or just walking through Central Park without a bodyguard trailing him. "Stop slouching," Richard snapped, not looking up from his phone. "You look like a defeated puppy. We are celebrating Harrison. Try to look like a winner for once." Harrison straightened his spine, a reflex honed by years of conditioning. "I'm not slouching, Dad, and I'm not sure what we're celebrating. You acquiring the Kensington block, you know those families are going to be evicted." Richard finally looked up, his expression mingling amusement with disgust. He took a sip of his Scotch Macallan 25 neat. "It's called Progress, Harrison. It's called cleaning up the city. Those tenements are an eyesore. We're building the future. Sterling Heights will be the jewel of the East Side. It's people's homes," Harrison said quietly. "It's real estate," Richard corrected his voice, like a gavel striking on wood. "And one day, if you ever decide to grow a pair and step up, it will be your real estate. Stop thinking like a poet and start thinking like a Sterling." Harrison looked out the window. The city lights of New York sprawled below them like a vast electric nervous system. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the golden handcuffs. He had a trust fund that could buy islands a degree from Wharton he hadn't wanted, and a future that felt like a prison sentence. "More wine," Richard barked, lifting his empty glass slightly in the air without looking at anyone specific. He expected the world to anticipate his thirst. From the shadows of the service station, a waitress stepped forward. Her name was Chloe Bennett. She was 22, though the dark circles under her eyes, carefully concealed with cheap concealer, made her look older. Her uniform was crisp, a white button-down, a black apron, black trousers, but her shoes were worn at the soles. She had been on her feet for 10 hours straight. She was 2 semesters away from a nursing degree at NYU, and her bank account was currently sitting at $42. Her mother's medical bills had cleared out everything else earlier that morning. She moved quickly, balancing the heavy bottle of Chateau Margaux. She was invisible to men like Richard Sterling, a mechanism of service rather than a human being. "Yes, sir," Chloe said softly. She approached the table, her hand trembling slightly. It wasn't nerves. It was exhaustion. She hadn't eaten since 6 a.m. Richard didn't acknowledge her. He was busy typing a furious email to his VP of operations. "If the zoning permits aren't on my desk by Monday, heads will roll," he muttered to himself. Harrison watched Chloe. He noticed the way her wrist shook as she lifted the heavy bottle. He noticed the small frayed thread on her cuff. He saw a person. "Let me help." Harrison started to reach out, sensing the instability. "Don't," Richard snapped at his son. "She's paid to pour. Let her pour." It happened in slow motion. Richard, animated by his own irritation, gestured wildly with his left hand as he emphasized a point about incompetent contractors. His heavy gold signet ring caught the edge of Chloe's arm just as she tilted the bottle. The collision was minor, but the physics were unforgiving. The bottle slipped from her damp, tired fingers. It didn't shatter, but it tipped aggressively, the dark red liquid surging out like a severed artery. It splashed across the pristine white tablecloth, over the Wagyu beef, and most disastrously across the lap of Richard Sterling's $8,000 suit. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a bomb that had landed, but hadn't yet detonated. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The dark stain on Richard's trousers expanded rapidly, a Rorschach test of impending doom. Chloe froze. Her face drained of all color, leaving her looking like a wax statue. Her breath hitched in her throat, a small, terrified squeak escaping her lips. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Sir, I am so sorry. She reached for a napkin, her hands shaking so violently she dropped it. Richard Sterling stood up. The chair scraped against the marble floor, a harsh, screeching sound that made heads turn at the nearby tables. He looked down at his ruined suit, then up at Chloe. His face wasn't red. It was a cold, pale mask of fury. "You stupid girl," Richard said. His voice wasn't loud, which made it terrifying. It was a low, venomous hiss that carried across the room. "I'm sorry I slipped, Chloe stammered, tears instantly welling in her eyes. She grabbed a cloth from her apron, instinctively reaching out to dab at the suit. Richard swatted her hand away, as if she were a contagious disease. "Do not touch me," he snarled. "You've done enough damage." He stepped out from the table, looming over her. Richard was 6'2", and Chloe was barely 5'5". He used every inch of that height to make her feel small. "Do you know how much this suit costs?" Richard asked, his voice rising now, drawing the attention of the entire dining room. "This suit costs more than you will make in a year. Probably more than your entire family has ever seen." "Dad, stop," Harrison said, standing up. "It was an accident. You hit her arm." Richard spun on his son. "Stay out of this, Harrison. This is exactly why you're weak. You tolerate incompetence. This isn't an accident. This is negligence. This is what happens when you let unskilled, brainless nobodies handle things of value." He turned back to Chloe, who was now crying openly, her head bowed in shame. The manager, a sweaty man named Mr. Farrant, was sprinting across the dining room, but Richard wasn't waiting. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Richard shouted. Chloe looked up, her mascara running. She was shaking. "You are worthless," Richard spat the words. "You are a clumsy, uneducated waste of space. I come here for excellence, and I get this, you shouldn't be serving food. You should be eating out of a dumpster." The cruelty of the insult hung in the air. The other diners, CEOs, socialites, politicians, watched. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Others looked amused, sipping their wine, treating it like live theater. Nobody stood up. Nobody said a word. Except Harrison. Harrison felt a coldness wash over him. It was a strange sensation. Usually when his father went on a rampage, Harrison felt heat, embarrassment, anger, panic. But this time he felt ice. He looked at Chloe. He saw the devastation in her eyes. It wasn't just about the job. It was the stripping of her dignity in front of 50 people. He looked at his father, a man the world called a titan of industry. At that moment, Harrison didn't see a titan. He saw a bully. He saw a small, sad man wrapped in expensive fabric. "You're fired!" Richard yelled as Mr. Farrant arrived, breathless. "Farrant, get this trash out of my sight immediately. And if I see a bill for tonight, I will buy this building just to evict you." "Yes, Mr. Sterling. Of course, Mr. Sterling." "Immediately," Farrant grovelled, grabbing Chloe by the elbow. "Chloe Kitchen, now, leave your apron." "But my tips," Chloe sobbed softly. "I need the... Go." Farrant hissed. Richard wiped his pants with a napkin, throwing the stained cloth onto the floor where Chloe had been standing. "Disgusting," he muttered. He looked at Harrison. "Sit down. We're ordering another bottle, and I'm going to make sure she never works in this city again." Harrison looked at the empty space where Chloe had stood. He looked at the stained napkin on the floor. "Sit down, Harrison," Richard commanded, picking up the menu. Harrison didn't sit. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He placed it on the table screen down. Then he reached for his wallet. "I said sit down," Richard said, his eyes narrowing. "Don't make a scene." "You already made the scene, Dad," Harrison said. His voice was steady, surprisingly steady. "You know, for 24 years I've tried to figure out how to be you. I thought the problem was me. I thought I just wasn't hard enough." "You aren't," Richard sneered. "No." Harrison smiled a sad, final smile. "I'm not, and thank God for that." Harrison reached for his glass of water. He held it for a second, looking at the light refracting through the crystal. "What are you doing?" Richard asked, sensing a shift he didn't understand. "I'm resigning," Harrison said. "Resigning from what you're my son. You can't resign from being my son." "Watch me." Harrison took the glass of water and poured it directly onto the table, right over his father's pristine Patek Philippe watch and his phone. Richard jumped back, stunned. "Have you lost your mind?" "I'm leaving the company, Dad," Harrison said, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "I'm leaving the penthouse, I'm leaving the trust fund, and I'm leaving you." "You wouldn't dare." Richard laughed, though it sounded nervous. "You won't last an hour without my credit cards. You're nothing without the Sterling name." Harrison walked around the table. He leaned in close to his father's ear. "The Sterling name is mud. You just don't know it yet." Harrison turned and walked toward the kitchen doors, ignoring the stunned gasps of the restaurant. He didn't look back at his father. He was looking for Chloe. But he wasn't just going to apologize. He was about to do something that would make the front page of the New York Times. The kitchen of the Obsidian Room was a chaotic ballet of shouting chefs and clanging pans, but the back alley was a desolate strip of wet asphalt and flickering neon. Harrison pushed through the heavy metal service door, the cool night air hitting his flushed face. He scanned the alley. Chloe was there. She was sitting on a plastic milk crate near the dumpster, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders were heaving. She had already stripped off her apron, which lay in a crumpled heap in a puddle. Harrison approached slowly. He didn't want to startle her, but in a tailored suit in a dark alley, he knew he looked like a threat. "Chloe," he said softly. She jumped, her head snapping up. Her eyes were red and swollen. When she saw him, saw the sterling jawline, the expensive suit, she flinched. She stood up, backing away, until she hit the brick wall. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm leaving. I'm going. Please don't. Did he send you here? Does he want to yell at me some more?" "No," Harrison said, raising his hands in surrender. "No, he didn't send me. I came on my own." "Look, I'm sorry about the suit," she cried, wiping her nose with her sleeve. "I don't have money to pay for it. I have nothing. Please just tell him I'm sorry." Harrison felt his heart break. This woman was terrified of financial ruin over a piece of fabric. "Chloe, listen to me," Harrison said, stepping into the light of the street lamp so she could see his face clearly. "I don't care about the suit. My father he is a monster. I came to apologize." Chloe blinked, confused. "You came to apologize. You're a sterling." "I'm trying not to be," Harrison muttered. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook. It was the emergency checkbook drawn on his personal trust money his grandmother had left him, separate from his father's direct control. It was the only money he had that he felt was truly his. He uncapped a fountain pen. "I know this doesn't fix the humiliation," Harrison said, writing quickly against the rough surface of the brick wall. "And I know it doesn't give you your job back. But I heard you mention bills." He tore the check out and held it toward her. Chloe hesitated. She looked at the paper, then at him. "I can't take your money. I'm not a charity case." "It's not charity," Harrison said firmly. "It's damages. My father assaulted you. He hit your arm. I saw it. This is a settlement." She reached out tentatively and took the check. She looked at the number. Her eyes went wide. She gasped, dropping her hand to her mouth. $50,000, she whispered. Is that enough to cover school?" Harrison asked. "And whatever else you need for a while." "I can't." She tried to hand it back, though her hands were trembling. "This is crazy. Why would you do this?" "Because I watched him break you," Harrison said. "And I'm tired of watching." "Harrison?" The voice boomed from the kitchen doorway. Richard Sterling stood there framed by the light, his face purple with exertion. Mr. Farrant stood behind him. "Get away from that girl," Richard shouted, stepping into the alley. "Giving handouts to the help, is that your rebellion? Pathetic." Richard marched over, snatching the check from Chloe's hand before she could react. He looked at the amount and ripped it into confetti. "You have no access to this account anymore," Richard sneered, throwing the paper scraps into the puddle. "I called the bank 3 minutes ago. I froze everything. You are cut off, Harrison. You have nothing. No cards, no cash, no apartment." He turned to Chloe, smiling cruelly. "And you get nothing. Now get off my property before I call the police for trespassing." Chloe looked at the shredded check in the water. The hope that had sparked for 10 seconds was extinguished. She looked at Harrison with pity. "It's okay," she whispered to Harrison. "Thank you for trying." She turned to walk away into the dark street. "Wait," Harrison said. He didn't scream it. He said it with a terrifying calmness. Harrison took off his Rolex, a Daytona worth $25,000. He unclasped it and held it out. "Dad," Harrison said, "you froze the accounts, but you forgot my assets." He walked over to Chloe and pressed the heavy gold watch into her hand. "Take this. There's a pawn shop on 8th Avenue that stays open late. Don't take less than 20 grand for it." "Harrison, you idiot!" Richard lunged, but Harrison shoved his father back. It was a firm, hard shove to the chest. Richard stumbled his expensive shoes, slipping on the wet pavement, and he fell hard onto his backside, right into the puddle of garbage juice and rainwater. "I'm done," Harrison said, looming over his father. "You'll starve," Richard screamed from the ground, his dignity shattered. "You don't know how to work. You've never worked a day in your life." Harrison looked at his father. Then he looked at the kitchen door, where the staff dishwashers, sous chefs, bussers had gathered to watch. They were silent, wide-eyed. Harrison took off his suit jacket. He folded it neatly and dropped it on top of the dumpster. He unbuttoned his cuffs and rolled up his sleeves. Chloe, Harrison said, turning to her. Do you know any places hiring? She looked at him, clutching the watch. A small, genuine smile broke through her tears. My friend manages a diner in Queens. It's not the Obsidian Room. Good, Harrison said. I'm in the mood for a burger. He looked back at his father one last time. Goodbye, Richard. Harrison Sterling, the heir to the empire, walked out of the alleyway alongside the fired waitress, leaving the billionaire sitting in the trash. But the story didn't end there. In fact, the real twist was just beginning. Because someone had been recording from the kitchen window, the subway ride to Queens was a sensory assault Harrison wasn't prepared for. He had spent his life in the back of soundproofed town cars with tinted windows and climate control set to a perpetual 68 degrees. The N train was a different universe. It smelled of stale ozone, wet wool, and exhaustion. The fluorescent lights flickered with a rhythmic, headache-inducing buzz, and the car swayed violently, throwing him against a man holding a dripping umbrella. "Watch it, buddy," the man grumbled. "Sorry," Harrison murmured, gripping the metal pole. He looked at Chloe. She was sitting on the plastic bench, her eyes closed, her head resting against the graffiti-covered window. She looked fragile, like a porcelain doll that had been glued back together in the dark. She opened one eye. "You look like you're on a safari." Harrison managed a weak smile. "I think I've been to Antarctica more times than I've been to Astoria." "Well, welcome to the real world," she said. "It's louder here, and it smells worse, but the pizza is better." They got off at Ditmars Boulevard. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflective under the streetlights. Harrison felt exposed. He was still wearing his suit trousers and dress shirt, though the sleeves were rolled up. Without the jacket, he looked like a banker who had lost a bet. Their first stop was a pawn shop called Gold and Glory on 31st Street. The clerk, a man named Vinny, with a neck tattoo of a scorpion, looked at the Rolex Daytona with skepticism. "It's stolen," Vinny said flatly, tossing it back on the glass counter. "It's not stolen," Harrison said, his voice firm. "I have the papers in my wallet. It's mine. I'm Harrison Sterling." Vinny looked up. He squinted. Then he pulled out his phone and tapped the screen a few times. He turned the phone around. On the screen was a video paused on a blurry frame of Harrison shoving Richard Sterling into a puddle. The title read, "Billionaire Beat Down, Sunco's Dad in Alley." "Holy smokes!" Vinny laughed, a rasping sound like sandpaper on wood. "That's you. You're the guy who dunked Richie Rich." Harrison sighed. "That's my father." "Not anymore, looks like." Vinny grinned. He picked up the watch again, treating it with new respect. "All right, kid, because you gave the old man a bath, I'll give you a fair price. 18,000. Cash." "It's worth 25, Harrison countered automatically. 19, Vinny said. "And I don't call the cops." "Deal." Harrison walked out with a thick envelope of $100 bills. He handed 15,000 to Chloe immediately. "This is for school," he said. "And your mum." Chloe tried to argue, but Harrison shoved the envelope into her purse. "Don't. Just don't. I kept $4,000 for myself. That's more than enough to find a place to sleep." "You're sleeping on my couch," Chloe said. It wasn't a question. You don't know how to rent an apartment without a credit history, and you definitely don't know which motels have bed bugs. You're coming with me. Chloe's apartment was a fourth-floor walk-up above a laundromat. It was tiny, essentially a hallway, with a kitchenette and a bedroom attached, but it was warm. It smelled of vanilla candles and old books. For the next 3 days, Harrison Sterling, a man who had been groomed to run a conglomerate, learned how to live. He learned that instant coffee was drinkable if you didn't think about it too much. He learned that the radiator clanged at 3 o'clock a.m. like a hammer hitting an anvil. He learned that Chloe's mother, who called every morning from the hospital, had a laugh that could fill a room even through a crackling phone line. And he learned about Frankie's Diner. Frankie's was a relic of the 1950s that had somehow survived gentrification. It was owned by Frank the Tank Moretti, a man who was shaped like a keg of beer and had a heart of gold buried under layers of sarcasm. "So," Frank said, looking Harrison up and down on Tuesday morning. Harrison was wearing a pair of jeans and a flannel shirt Chloe had bought him from a thrift store. "You're the prince." "I'm just Harrison," he said. "I need a job. Chloe said you needed a dishwasher." "I need a dishwasher who knows that water is wet," Frank grunted. "You ever washed a dish?" "I have a degree in economics from Wharton," Harrison offered. "Great," Frank said. "That'll be really useful when you're scraping egg yolk off a plate. 7 days a week, minimum wage, plus tips if the waitresses like you. Start now." Harrison started. The first hour was a disaster. He broke 3 plates. He burned his hand on the hot water sprayer. He slipped on a piece of lettuce and nearly took out a busboy. But he didn't quit. He gritted his teeth, rolled up his thrift store flannel, and kept scrubbing. By the end of the shift, he was soaked, smelling of grease and ketchup, and his back ached in a way he didn't know was possible. He sat in the back booth with Chloe, staring at a burger like it was the Holy Grail. "You did good," Chloe said, sliding a milkshake toward him. "I broke 4 plates." Harrison groaned. 3, she corrected. "And you didn't cry. That's better than the last guy." Harrison took a sip of the milkshake. It was strawberry. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. "Check your phone," Chloe said quietly. Harrison pulled out his shattered iPhone. He had avoided it for days, but now he opened Twitter. The video was everywhere. It had 40 million views. The comments were a war zone. User 88. Finally, someone stood up to that tyrant Richard Sterling, money mogul, ungrateful brat. He'll be back crawling to daddy in a week. Sarah J. Who is the girl? She's the real victim here. Anon, I heard the son is working at a diner in Queens now. Legend. Harrison scrolled. There were memes of his father sitting in the puddle. There were remixes of the splat sound. But there was also something else. An article from the Wall Street Journal. Headline, Sterling stock dips 4% amidst family feud. Board of Directors calls emergency meeting. "He's hurting," Harrison whispered. "Actually hurting. He's angry," Chloe warned. "And men like your father, when they get angry, they don't just get mad. They get even." As if on cue, the diner door opened. But it wasn't a customer. 2 men in dark suits walked in. They weren't police. They weren't customers. They were lawyers. Specifically, they were from the firm Pendleton, Crane and Sterling. They scanned the room, ignoring the "Please wait to be seated" sign. Their eyes locked on the back booth. Harrison stiffened. "Here we go." One of the men, a sharp-faced lawyer named Arthur Pendleton, whom Harrison had known since childhood, walked over. He placed a thick manila envelope on the sticky table right next to the strawberry milkshake. "Hello, Harrison," Arthur said. His voice was devoid of warmth. "Your father sends his regards." "What is this, Arthur?" Harrison asked, not touching the envelope. "A cease and desist," Arthur said, "and a lawsuit for defamation of character, assault, and battery. We are suing you for $50 million. Chloe gasped. $50 million. He doesn't have $50 million. Arthur turned his cold gaze to Chloe. "And for you, Miss Bennett, we have a separate filing. Grand larceny. You are in possession of a stolen watch worth $25,000. Unless it is returned within 24 hours, we will be filing criminal charges." "I sold it," Harrison said, standing up. "It was mine to sell. According to the insurance policy your father holds, it was company property. Arthur smiled thinly. Technically, you embezzled company assets. Arthur adjusted his tie. You have 24 hours to issue a public apology, retract your statements, and return the funds. If you do, your father is willing to drop the lawsuits and allow you to return home. Into rehab, of course, to treat your mental breakdown. Rehab. Harrison laughed bitterly. I'm not crazy, Arthur. You're washing dishes in Queens, Arthur said, looking around the diner with disdain. To your father, that is the definition of insanity. Arthur tapped the envelope. Tomorrow. Noon. Or we bury you both. The lawyers turned and walked out, leaving a silence in the diner that was louder than the subway train. Harrison looked at Chloe. She was pale, her hands gripping the table. I can't go to jail, she whispered. My mum. She needs me. I can't have a record. Harrison looked at the envelope. He felt the old fear rising, the fear of his father's omnipotence. Richard Sterling could buy judges. He could buy time. He could crush them with paperwork alone. But then Harrison looked at his hands. They were red from the hot water. They were calloused. They were the hands of a man who had worked for his dinner. You're not going to jail, Harrison said. How do you know? Chloe cried. They have lawyers. We have milkshake. Harrison picked up the envelope. He didn't open it. He just weighed it in his hand. My father made a mistake, Harrison said, a dark glint entering his eye. What mistake? He thinks I'm still playing by his rules, Harrison said. He thinks I'm trying to win a legal battle, but I'm not. Harrison, what are you talking about? Harrison pulled out his phone. Arthur said, company property. He said the watch was a company asset. That means the insurance claim he filed is fraud. I bought that watch with my grandmother's inheritance money. I have the receipt in my email. So, Chloe asked. So. Harrison smiled, and it was a smile that looked terrifyingly like his father's, but sharpened by justice. If he filed an insurance claim on it, he committed insurance fraud. And that's a felony, but that's small potatoes. Harrison stood up. He wants a war. Okay, I know where the bodies are buried. Literally. Literally, Chloe squeaked. Figuratively, but close enough. Harrison grabbed his coat. Chloe, I need you to borrow Frank's laptop. I need to write an email. To who? To the IRS, Harrison said, and the zoning board, and the New York Times. He looked at the door where the lawyers had exited. My father built his empire on secrets, Harrison said. I was the keeper of those secrets. He forgot that when you fire the gatekeeper, the gate stays open. The next morning, the war did not begin in a courtroom. It began on the internet and it spread to the streets. Harrison had spent the entire night typing. He didn't have access to the Sterling servers anymore, but he had something better, an eidetic memory. He remembered dates. He remembered names of shell companies in the Cayman Islands. He remembered the specific bribes paid to building inspectors in 2018 to overlook the asbestos in the Midtown Towers project. He compiled it all into a document he titled The Sterling Standard. He didn't publish it yet. He just sent a screenshot of the first page to Arthur Pendleton. The text accompanying the screenshot was simple. Drop the lawsuits. Drop the charges against Chloe. Or I hit send. At 9 a.m., Harrison and Chloe were back at Frankie's diner, prepping for the lunch rush. Harrison was exhausted, his eyes gritty, but he was running on adrenaline. At 9:15 a.m., the retaliation arrived. But it wasn't a phone call from Arthur. A large white van pulled up to the curb. The side of the van read, NYC Department of Health. 3 inspectors marched in clipboards in hand. They didn't smile. They didn't ask for a table. They walked straight into the kitchen. "Health inspection," the lead inspector barked. "Shut down the grill. Everybody out of the kitchen." Frank Moretti stormed out from the back office. "I just had an inspection 2 months ago. I got an A grade." "Random spot check," the inspector said, already opening the walk-in fridge. "We received an anonymous tip about a rodent infestation." "Rodents?" Frank screamed. "I don't have rats. I have cats in the alley." "We'll see," the inspector said. 10 minutes later, one of the inspectors emerged from the basement, holding a dead rat in a plastic bag. It looked stiff. It looked planted. "Code violation," the inspector announced, loud enough for the customers to hear. "Severe infestation. We're closing you down immediately. Revoking the license pending a hearing." "You planted that," Harrison shouted, stepping forward. "I was in the basement an hour ago. That wasn't there." The inspector glared at Harrison. "Interfering with a health officer is a crime, son. Step back." Frank looked defeated. His face was grey. "I can't close down, even for a week. The rent, the margins." Harrison saw the look on Frank's face. He saw Chloe's terror. This was his father's reach. Richard Sterling couldn't get to Harrison directly without risking the documents leaking, so he was attacking the people protecting him. He was burning the village to flush out the rebel. The customers began to leave, muttering about rats. The closed sign was flipped. Frank sat on a stool, head in his hands. "I'm sorry, Frank," Harrison said quietly. "This is because of me." "You think?" Frank snapped. Then he sighed. "Look, kid, I know who your dad is. I know how this works. But this is my life. I can't fight a billionaire." "You won't have to," Harrison said. Harrison walked out of the diner. He stood on the sidewalk of Queens, the wind whipping his hair. He took out his phone. He didn't call Arthur. He called a number he hadn't dialed in 3 years. "Julian," Harrison said when the line picked up. "Harrison." The voice on the other end was incredulous. Julian was an investigative journalist for an independent network, a man Richard Sterling had sued into near oblivion years ago. "I thought you were dead, or scrubbing toilets." "I am scrubbing toilets," Harrison said. "And I have a story for you, exclusive, but we have to do it live, today." "What kind of story?" "The kind that puts people in handcuffs," Harrison said. "Meet me at Sterling Tower, the plaza, 1 hour." 1 hour later, Harrison stood in front of the massive glass skyscraper that bore his last name, Sterling Tower. It rose 50 stories into the blue sky, a monument to ego. A small crowd had gathered. They recognized Harrison from the viral video. Phones were out recording. Julian arrived with a cameraman. They set up quickly. "We're live in 3, 2, Julian pointed to Harrison. "My name is Harrison Sterling," Harrison said, looking directly into the camera lens. "And up until 3 days ago, I was the Vice President of Strategic Development for the building behind me." He pointed up. "My father, Richard Sterling, just shut down a small business in Queens using a bribed health inspector because I work there. He assaulted a waitress named Chloe Bennett because she spilled wine. He thinks he is untouchable." Harrison held up a flash drive. "But he isn't. This drive contains proof that Sterling Construction has been using substandard steel in 3 of its major residential projects. Steel that is not earthquake-rated. Steel that puts thousands of lives at risk to save 4% on the bottom line." The crowd gasped. The cameraman zoomed in on the drive. "I am turning this evidence over to the FBI immediately after this broadcast," Harrison said. "But I wanted the public to know first, because my father will try to bury this. He will try to bury me." Harrison stepped closer to the camera. "Dad, if you're watching, the rent comes due today." 44 floors up inside the executive suite, Richard Sterling smashed his Scotch glass against the wall. The amber liquid rained down on the expensive carpet. "Cut the feed!" he screamed at his assistant. "Call the networks. Tell them he's mentally unstable. Tell them he's on drugs." "Sir Arthur," Pendleton said, his voice trembling for the first time in 20 years. He was looking at his tablet. "The FBI is already in the lobby. They have a warrant." Richard froze. The blood drained from his face. "A warrant for what?" "Racketeering," Arthur whispered. "And fraud. It seems Harrison didn't just leak the Steele reports. He leaked the emails where you authorized the bribes." Richard ran to the window. He looked down. Far below in the plaza, he saw the small figure of his son. And then he saw the flashing lights. Not one police car. Dozens. Down in the plaza, Harrison lowered the microphone. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Chloe. She had taken a cab to follow him. "You did it," she said, her eyes wide. "You actually did it." "I burned it down," Harrison said, looking at the tower. He felt a strange mixture of grief and liberation. "I burned the whole thing down." "Not everything," Chloe said. She took his hand. Her hand was warm, rough from work, and real. "You saved Frank. You saved yourself." Just then, the glass doors of the lobby burst open. Agents in windbreakers, emblazoned with FBI, swarmed out, but they weren't coming for Harrison. They were securing the perimeter. Then a sight that stopped traffic on Fifth Avenue. Richard Sterling, the Lion of New York, was walked out in handcuffs. He looked smaller than Harrison had ever seen him. His jacket was draped over his wrists to hide the cuffs. But everyone knew. As Richard was led past the press cordon, he locked eyes with Harrison. There was no anger left in Richard's eyes. Only shock. He looked at his son like he was seeing a stranger he had severely underestimated. Harrison didn't look away. He didn't gloat. He just nodded a silent acknowledgement of the tragedy of it all. "Come on," Harrison said to Chloe, turning his back on the media circus that was erupting. "We have to go." "Go where?" Chloe asked. "To celebrate." "No," Harrison said. "We have to go back to the diner. Frank needs help cleaning up before we can reopen." "You're going back to finish your shift." Chloe laughed, a sound of pure disbelief. "I need the money." Harrison shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "I'm saving up for a suit, a cheap one." They walked away from the flashing cameras, disappearing into the anonymity of the New York crowd. But the drama wasn't over, because while Richard was going to prison, the Sterling Empire had other wolves circling it. And Harrison didn't realize that by destroying his father, he had created a power vacuum that a much more dangerous enemy was preparing to fill. And that enemy was someone Harrison trusted. For 72 hours, Harrison Sterling experienced something he had never felt before: peace. The media storm raged outside, but inside the greasy, warm cocoon of Frankie's diner, the world made sense. He peeled potatoes until his fingers were raw. He swept floors. He learned that Frank Moretti liked his coffee with 3 sugars, and that Chloe hummed old jazz standards when she was refilling the ketchup bottles. Harrison felt useful. For the first time in his life, his value wasn't determined by his last name, but by the cleanliness of the plates he stacked. But nature abhors a vacuum, and corporate power is no different. On Friday afternoon, the diner was buzzing. The health inspection sign had been triumphantly torn down, replaced by a banner Chloe had made that read, "Under new management, sort of." Locals hearing the news of Harrison's stand against his father had flooded the place. They wanted to see the billionaire dishwasher. They left big tips. Harrison was in the back, scraping a grill when the front door chimed. The air in the diner changed instantly. The chatter died down. Chloe appeared at the kitchen window. Her face was pale. "Harrison," she whispered. "It's him." Not your dad. The other one. Harrison wiped his hands on a rag and stepped out. Standing in the center of the diner was Arthur Pendleton. But he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a woman Harrison recognized, Linda Grave, the city councilwoman for Queens, and two men holding architectural blueprints. Arthur looked different. With Richard in a holding cell at the Metropolitan Detention Center, Arthur wasn't the subservient lawyer anymore. He stood taller. He wore a suit that was sharper. He looked like a man who had finally stepped out of the shadow and found he enjoyed the sun. "Arthur," Harrison said, walking around the counter. "If you're here to sue me again, get in line. The FBI took my laptop, so I have nothing left to leak." "Sue you?" Arthur chuckled a dry, rattling sound. "Harrison, my boy, I'm here to thank you. Thank me." "You removed the only obstacle in my path," Arthur said, gesturing to the empty space where Richard usually loomed. "Your father was a visionary, yes, but he was sentimental. He held on to assets that were inefficient." Arthur placed the blueprints on the counter. He smoothed them out with a manicured hand. With Richard indicted and the stock price in freefall, the board of directors panicked. They named me interim CEO this morning. My first duty is to stabilize the company's liquidity. Harrison looked at the blueprints. His blood ran cold. It was a demolition plan. The map showed the entire block, the laundromat, the bodega, the small apartments, and Frankie's diner. Superimposed over them was a sleek, soulless glass cube labeled Pendleton Logistics Center. "You're selling the block," Harrison said. "Not selling," Arthur corrected. "Repurposing. We own the debt on these properties. We've owned it for years through shell companies. Your father kept this neighborhood alive as a pet project because he liked the pizza at the place on the corner." "I don't like pizza, Harrison. I like profit." "You can't do this," Frank Moretti shouted, stepping forward. "My grandfather built this place. We have a lease." "You have a month-to-month lease," Arthur said coldly. "And I'm terminating it. You have 48 hours to vacate. The bulldozers are scheduled for Monday morning." "This is retaliation," Chloe said, her voice shaking. "It's business," Arthur smiled. He turned to Harrison. "You wanted to save the world, Harrison. You wanted to expose the truth. Well, the truth is, the Sterling Empire is bleeding money because of you. The only way to save the company, to save the pensions of the thousands of employees you claim to care about, is to liquidate low-value assets, like this dump." Arthur leaned in close to Harrison. "You killed your father, Harrison, and in doing so, you handed the crown to me. And unlike Richard, I don't have a soft spot for you. If you are on this property on Monday, I will have you arrested for trespassing." Arthur signaled to his entourage. "Come, councilwoman. We have a ribbon cutting to plan." They swept out of the diner, leaving a silence that was far heavier than the one Richard had left days ago. This wasn't just humiliation. This was erasure. Frank sank into a booth. He looked old. 48 hours? I can't move a kitchen in 48 hours. It's over." Chloe looked at Harrison. She didn't say anything, but her eyes were pleading. "Fix this." Harrison stared at the door. He felt a wave of nausea. He had destroyed his father to stop the corruption, but he had unleashed a predator who had no code at all. Richard Sterling was a bully, but he was a builder. Arthur Pendleton was a scavenger. Harrison took off his apron. "Where are you going?" Chloe asked. "I have to go to the one person who knows where the bodies are buried," Harrison said. "Arthur said you exposed everything," Chloe said. "I exposed the steal," Harrison said, grabbing his coat. "But Arthur has been the company lawyer for 30 years. He has skeletons, too. And I know who has the key to the closet." "Who?" "The man I put in prison," Harrison said. The Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn was a fortress of concrete and misery. It smelled of industrial cleaner and despair. Harrison sat in the visitation room behind a thick pane of plexiglass. He wore his thrift store flannel. On the other side, Richard Sterling was led in by 2 guards. Richard looked diminished. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit that was 2 sizes too big. His silver hair was unkempt. The titan of industry was gone. In his place was inmate 74309. Richard sat down. He picked up the phone receiver. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. "You came to gloat?" Richard asked. His voice was raspy. "No," Harrison said. "I came to talk about Arthur." Richard's eyes flickered. A spark of the old intelligence returned. "Arthur, the snake. I saw the news in the common room. Interim CEO. "He's liquidating the Queen's block," Harrison said. "He's bulldozing Frankie's diner on Monday. He's going to gut the company, Dad. He's going to sell off the assets, take a golden parachute, and leave the Sterling name in the mud." Richard let out a short, bitter laugh. "And why should I care?" "You put me here, Harrison. You destroyed my legacy. Let Arthur pick over the bones." "Because it's your name." Harrison slammed his hand against the glass. The guard stepped forward, but Harrison ignored him. "Dad, look at me. I hated how you treated people. I hated the bullying. But I know you loved the buildings. You loved building things that lasted. Arthur doesn't build. He destroys." Richard looked at his son. He studied him for a long moment. "You look like your grandfather," Richard murmured. He was a stubborn bastard, too. "Arthur is using the distressed asset protocol to bypass the shareholder vote," Harrison said, slipping into business mode. "He's citing the stock crash I caused to seize emergency powers." "He was always clever," Richard nodded. "I paid him to be clever." "How do I stop him?" Harrison asked. "I have no money. I have no shares. I have nothing." Richard leaned forward. His breath fogged the glass. "You have something," Richard said softly. "You just don't know it." "What?" "Your mother," Richard said. Harrison froze. His mother had died when he was 6. She was a subject that was never discussed in the Sterling household. "When she died?" Richard said, his voice cracking slightly. "She didn't trust me to take care of you. She knew what I was. So she created a poison pill trust, a separate entity." "I know about the trust," Harrison said. Arthur froze it. "He froze your allowance," Richard corrected. "He didn't freeze the voting rights. Your mother left you 10% of the voting stock of Sterling Corp. But it was held in a blind trust until you turned 25. "I'm 24, Harrison said, deflated. "Or," Richard continued, "until the death or incarceration of the primary trustee." "Which is me." Richard smiled. It was a crooked, sad smile. "By putting me in prison, Harrison, you unlocked your inheritance. You are the largest single shareholder of Sterling Corp right now. You have the power to veto the liquidation. You have the power to fire Arthur." Harrison stared at his father. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was afraid," Richard whispered. "I was afraid if you had power, you wouldn't need me anymore." And I was right. The silence stretched between them. A lifetime of misunderstandings, pressure, and pain hung in the air. "Thank you," Harrison said quietly. "Harrison," Richard said as the guard signaled time was up. "Don't be like me. Be better." Monday morning, 7 a.m. The bulldozers were already lined up on Ditmars Boulevard. The engine exhaust pumped grey smoke into the Queen's sky. A crowd of protesters, locals, regulars from the diner, and Chloe stood in front of Frankie's linking arms. Frank Moretti stood with a baseball bat, looking ready to go down swinging. Arthur Pendleton stood on the sidewalk checking his watch. He signaled to the foreman. "Tear it down! If they don't move, the police will move them. The engines revved. The massive yellow claw of the lead bulldozer lifted, poised to strike the brick facade of the diner. Stop. The voice wasn't loud, but it projected with a command that cut through the noise. Harrison Sterling walked into the middle of the street. He was wearing a suit. Not one of his bespoke Italian suits, but a $200 suit he had bought at a department store the night before. It didn't fit perfectly, but he wore it like armor. "Get out of the way, Harrison," Arthur shouted. "You're trespassing." "Actually," Harrison said, pulling a document from his jacket pocket. "You are." Harrison walked up to the bulldozer. He handed the paper to the foreman. Then he turned to Arthur. "This is a court order issued at 6:00 a.m. this morning," Harrison announced, "invoking the Article 9 bylaws of the Sterling Corporation. As the holder of the Class A priority, shares formerly held by the Elizabeth Sterling Trust, I am calling for an immediate emergency board meeting." Arthur's face went white. "That trust is locked." "Not since my father was booked into federal prison," Harrison said. "His incarceration triggered the transfer. I own 10%, and I have the proxy votes of 3 other board members who really don't like you, Arthur." Harrison stepped closer to Arthur. "I am hereby vetoing the liquidation of the Queen's assets, and acting as the majority voting bloc, I am terminating your contract as interim CEO for cause." "For cause?" Arthur sputtered. "What cause?" "Gross incompetence," Harrison smiled, "and conspiracy to defraud the shareholders. We found the emails, Arthur, the ones where you shorted the stock before the announcement." Police sirens wailed in the distance. This time they weren't for Richard. Arthur Pendleton looked around. He saw the crowd cheering. He saw the bulldozer drivers turning off their engines. He saw his coup crumbling into dust. 6 months later. The neon sign of Frankie's Diner buzzed happily in the twilight. Inside, the place was packed. Harrison sat in the back booth, but he wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing jeans and a t-shirt. He had his laptop open, but he wasn't looking at stock tickers. He was looking at architectural plans for a new community center down the block, a non-profit project. Chloe slid into the booth next to him. She placed a strawberry milkshake on the table. "On the house," she said. "Boss?" "I'm not the boss," Harrison laughed. "I'm just a silent partner." He had kept his word. He hadn't taken over Sterling Corp. He had hired a boring ethical CEO to run the company-cleaned house and set up a fund to retrofit the bad steel in the buildings his father had built. He kept enough dividends to live comfortably, but he gave the rest away. He bought the building Frankie's Diner was in and signed the deed over to Frank Moretti for $1. "How is he?" Chloe asked, nodding at the letter on the table. It was from the prison. "He's okay," Harrison said. "He's teaching a business class to the other inmates. He says the cafeteria food is a crime against humanity, but he's losing weight." "And you?" Chloe asked. She reached out and took his hand. Her touch still sent a jolt through him, stronger than any deal he had ever closed. Harrison looked around the diner. He saw the steam rising from the coffee, the people laughing, the life happening in all its messy, beautiful glory. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Harrison said. He took a sip of the milkshake. It tasted like freedom. Harrison Sterling didn't just save a waitress. He saved his soul. He proved that sometimes you have to lose everything to find out who you really are. He walked away from $1 billion to stand in front of a bulldozer for a $20 meal. And the woman he loved. It's a reminder to all of us. Power isn't about the suit you wear or the car you drive. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice for what is right. What would you have done if you were Harrison? Would you have turned your own father in? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you enjoyed this story of justice, betrayal, and redemption, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that hits this hard. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.